Oh.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. Yes, thank you for making it to class. We got a lot to cover tonight, folks, so let me get this set up. I was hoping I'd get it set up before everyone got here, but this is what happens. They show up to class, and then you know. Not quite prepared. That's okay. Wow, we got a big class tonight. We got a lot of good stuff. Here, let me move this out of the way. Go. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll see that. Make sure this is lined up here. Oh. Okay, so there we go. We have our class today. Thank you so much for showing up to our How to Write a Script Film Lecture series. Today is a very special day. We got a good, let me get some lighting in here. The only problem I had with this classroom is we did not have the lighting. We did not have the lighting I wanted, so we're going to go 0 dark 30 here. When it comes to the lighting situation. Because, most classrooms, they're equipped with mood lighting, but we're just going to go bye-bye. There we go. Okay. Make sure this is up. So you're paying attention. Okay? Here we go. Talentment. Whoa. We are in our part 4, I believe, of Talentment. And man, what an amazing movie. One of the best scripts that we have in the lecture series altogether. So, very nice. Make sure that's turned down a little bit. But not enough so that you can't hear me. Because I got to really make sure you're paying attention here. This is very important. This class is going to be the most important one for Talentment. Whoa. So anyway, here we go. We're going to jump right into it. So here on my doc cam, we have the official Cinematic Prose screenplay draft. And wow. Real nice. So, in prior classes, we went through some of these scenes. In fact, let me pull out my little cheat code cheat sheet, which counts out all 38, I believe, scenes of the film. So here we go. Our first scene was George. Put that down here. George walking in a tuxedo through the nice part of town, right? That's our intro. Okay, next we see an alleyway, and he's assembling Margaret's torn letter, her desperate plead to the city and the developers trying to tear her down. Ooh. Okay, the next we see our little teenager at the bus stop near the development site, and he's ignoring his mom on the phone, and he's deleting this overdue notice that she forwarded to him through a text chain link. Okay, and so we see him, and he goes and he steals an energy drink, and he says, F you, blah, 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 to the clerk, and he's running, and next thing we see is Margaret. She's praying beside her bed, and her husband, Carl, is comforting her. Okay, and then George next is going to be at the Easter Bunny at the river, right? And that's when he's approached by his homeless friend who wants a cigarette. Says, I don't smoke, you shouldn't either. Then we're introduced to our single mom, the food bank. Next scene is George as a leprechaun getting beat up by the kid, funny enough. Which, man, that really wraps together nicely later in the film. It's very good. So, we see the single mom at the apartment door, right? That's our next scene with the pimp. The pimp trying to, like I said earlier, kind of like the city is doing to Margaret, the pimp is trying to tear her down. Tear her down. Okay? Ooh. And so we have George as Santa Claus later in that film. And, so he's Santa Claus. And I think we may have not got to that scene yet, but so after, because where we were last time, I believe, was right after the city development scene, right? Where we had the very charismatic but manipulative businessman approach Margaret and say, "Hey, I can save this fine establishment, miss. I can, do a lot of good things." And because he's an entrepreneur, he's in it for himself. And take that. Okay, there's the pimp. Pimps, they're bad. They're very bad. He's the antagonist, one of the antagonists in this story, at least on the surface level, symbolizing the failure of the city and protecting citizens. Not good. So here's Daniel talking to George about how, let's come up with this plan where you're going to interrupt the demolition because God can use anyone. And so George is the moral upstanding force in this film, so he definitely is he's prone to go for anything that's good, and so Daniel in this circumstance is actually trying to cause a really good thing. So, which was awesome. It's an awesome scene. Great scene. We have two colliding forces working together to take down the greater good. To take down the greater bad. So it's two opposing forces working together to take down the greater bad. They are the greater good, taking out the greater bad, which is the city, the mayor and the city developers and just the corrupt political systems and the corruptness of people being taken advantage of, like our poor old Margaret and her new morning bakery. So now our next scene, after the big standoff at Margaret Ellis's bakery, right? Ooh, hold on now, we're gonna make sure the mic is always more happy than me to tell you guys this stuff. It's pretty nice. Pretty good. We have to have a moderate volume. We have to have a very, very, very moderate volume because some of my students, they can't hear me very well. And that's part of the reason why our volume is a little up in the numbers, because we want to make sure that people are listening, and I just want to make sure everybody can hear me okay, because some of my classrooms you can't hear me so well, and that's nobody's fault. So we make sure to get that accessible for everyone. So here's the next scene after all of that. I know I keep kind of trailing off here. It's a big script, so forgive me. So at one point, while all of this is happening, when George is peacefully leading this protest, right? We have Daniel kind of looking from the side, laughing and everything. George is sitting there like this cowboy silhouette. He's against the steel machinery, and there's a reporter, right? So the reporter, the news vans are there, the whole town's there. And they're like, we're just hearing this property belongs to Margaret Ellis. And Margaret's name spreads like a fire, right? And so all of this happens, and so our next scene, after all of this craziness happens, we are taken into the city hall with the mayor, in the mayor's office. So here is a clean office with framed ribbon cuttings and campaign smiles. And Margaret sits across from the mayor, purse in her lap and hands trembling. She's a woman of faith. She didn't want any of this to happen. Didn't want any of this to happen, but it did. It very much did. So she's just as thrown off as the mayor, honestly. Who wouldn't be? Who wouldn't be? So, right, they're in this mayor's office, and the mayor is standing at the window, and his back is turned, and there's this long, eerie silence. And then he exhales a big sigh. Right, then turns slowly, sits behind his desk. He says, Mrs. Ellis, because of the situation outside of your property this week, and he chooses a word like it tastes bad when he's talking. The city has decided to rescind the demolition order, and Margaret blinks. She doesn't really process. She's just kind of like, like what? And he says, rescind. And he says, well, she says, rescind? And the mayor says, well, your permits will remain valid. Your business may continue operations. And Margaret's breath kind of catches. Her eyes are watering a little bit. She kind of laughs. She says, oh my goodness. And she shakes her head, clueless, but relieved. She's relieved. I don't understand, This poor old lady's about to lose her company, and then all of a sudden, after all this craziness happened, that she wasn't a part of course, she doesn't really understand what the hell's going on, but now the city's saying, oh, you can keep your business up, you're all good, everything's fine. And so the mayor kind of continues. Here's what the mayor says. Public pressure is significant. And Margaret's just kind of nodding. She's still kind of stunned. And she said, well, I saw a man on the television. She's referring to George, the cowboy. Right? And she says, well, he was sitting in front of my door. And her voice is kind of uncertain, because she doesn't know. She said, and she even said that, she said, I don't know why he did that. And the mayor avoids eye contact completely. He just kind of, He's very frustrated with the situation. He's got a lot of business to take care of, and he's trying to, successfully run this town. Your average political reaction when it comes to these things. And so she says, well, can I open tomorrow? And the mayor says, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So Margaret's shoulders drop, and relief floods her body like she's been holding her breath for months. And she's just kind of, beside herself. She's like, well, Carl is gonna, he's gonna make a spectacle of this. And she wipes a tear from her eye. She's so thankful that this happened. She said, thank you. And the mayor kind of nods stiffly, not very happy, and he says, we hope this matter quiets down. And Margaret just stands up and steadies herself and gets her grounding again. She says, it already feels quieter. She exits with a soft, grateful smile. Wonderful, wonderful. And so now here's our next scene. Here's our next scene. I don't even know if we talked about it in the last episode or not, but at some point, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. So our next scene is a really cool scene. It's going to be back to the single mom, right? She's sitting on a couch holding her sleeping children, bruises on her face, tears falling silently into her child's hair. And so that's why I paused earlier, because I'm not 100% sure if we went over this scene, but there is a scene, which, man, I got so many papers here. Okay. So here we go. After George is dressed as a leprechaun and the teenager kind of beats him up, there's a scene in there where the single mom is she's getting kicked out of a motel, right? She's on the job, she's a call girl, so she's at the job, and one of her clients, something goes south. We don't 100% know. But we see her get kicked out of this motel room by this, older looking dude. And she's got bruises on her face, and she's all messed up. And George looks from a distance, and he kind of goes up to her as she's walking away. And, he says, "You okay, miss?" And she doesn't answer because she's completely traumatized and in fear after not only being assaulted, but just in the situation she's in. So, she's not sure what to say, or how to say it, or when to say it, or what the hell's even going on. And that's when she kind of disappears, and George is still there, and he's dressed up as Santa Claus, as I think I mentioned that, which is very significant. Every costume he wears is very much placement of emotional value, placement of showing off certain situations. And so what happens is the pimp goes up to this motel room, and he talks to the guy that kicked out the single mom, and he says, "Sorry about that, won't happen again," gives him some money, and George is just lingering. George is lingering in the foreground, kind of watching. And he watches the pimp as he comes down the stairs, because they're looking up at the motel room. It's probably in the second or third story. And the pimp is walking away, kind of frustrated, but also kind of like, who cares, probably on drugs or something, probably high, it doesn't matter. That's usually what the pimp is doing anyway, just organized crime. You're very unorganized in your mind when you're a partaker of such. So he walks away, and George follows him, slowly but surely, in this big Santa Claus suit. He follows the pimp, and he sees from a distance, follows him all the way home, and the pimp goes into this house, and he takes him to what looks like a crack house, right? It's this chaotic drug house where there's, people using drugs and all kinds of random stuff. And so all of that just happened, and that's why this, I needed to tell you that before we jump into this. But anyway, so then the next scene, after everything we just read earlier, it's a little out of order, forgive me. We're at the single mom's apartment, and we see this montage. And she's sitting on the couch, holding her sleeping children. There's bruises on her face. Tears are falling quietly. And she's, apologizing, kind of whispering, "I'm so sorry." And she's just beside herself. She knows she's in trouble with the pimp. She knows she's not going to have anyone come and rescue her. No one's going to save her. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And the city doesn't care, the cops don't care, the neighborhood doesn't care. Okay, that's just the way life is. And so we're seeing that, right? And it's this montage. We're going to have music, and it's kind of go back and forth from her. And then we're going to see a city street late at night, and the police lights are flashing blue and red, and there's the teenager, right? Now we see the teenager, and he's running down an alleyway, jumping fences, his breath is raged, he's breathing enraged, and sirens are wailing, and, he's just running and running and running. You hear officers telling him, stop, 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 And goes back to the single mom's apartment. Her phone rings, and she looks down at her phone, and you can imagine who that is. So she puts it away. She just ignores it. And then we go back to the teenager. He's still running, and he nearly falls, and he's running. And, the whole montage just kind of tightens, faster cuts, breath, crying overlapping. And then our next scene just kind of concludes with the teenager and his getaway. So the teen bursts through the brush, and the bushes into darkness. And the sirens kind of fade behind him, and he stumbles into this dirt incline. And he's bent over, his hands are on his knees, and there's silence except a river. So he found himself running away from whatever crime he committed this time, and he's by the river. Now that's scary. Right? And so this is where he, if you remember earlier in the script, this is where George likes to hang out, is down by the river. And so he looks up, and there's a small camp, tent, hammock, low fire. George is sitting there. There's George. Now this time, George is dressed up as a military soldier. Old fatigues, worn boots, dog tags, catching faint firelight. Not theatrical, though. Nothing too theatrical, just more of outdated, Just kind of, the outfit looked like it was from like it was, like it belonged to a different era. And so the teen drops onto a rock near the camp, and he's out of breath, and he's trying to collect himself, and George doesn't stare, he doesn't judge, he's just calmly there. I mean, the kid stumbled into his camp, so he's just sitting there like, well, whatever. And then George, as silly George does, he says, well, once the kid's breathing again, he's like, hey, you going for a nightly run tonight? And the teen glares at him in exhaustion and says, shut up. Shut up. Right? And George unscrews this metal tin, and the smell of this harsh homemade alcohol, strong as fuel, kind of fills the area. It's this aroma, if you will. The teenager says, the fuck is this? Excuse my language, but that's what he says. And George says, 100 proof. It's 100 proof. And he says, well, you got to stay warm by the cold water. So the teenager, he wipes his mouth with his sleeve. He's disgusted, but, he's like, I'll try it. Try drinking it. Anyway, so he takes a big swig of it, and he goes, that's disgusting. And George says, you'll live. And there's the silence, the fire is popping, the river's moving. And the teenager kind of studies his uniform, and he says, why are you dressed as a soldier? And George sits and stirs the fire with the stick, and he's sitting there. He says, depends on who you ask. He says, the teenager says, you in the army or something? George says, no. But some fights don't give you a uniform. And the teenager kind of scoffs. Whatever. You look stupid. You look stupid. George looks at him. This kind of twisted smile. He says, well, that's the point. And silence. Like, there's silence after that. Like, the teen doesn't know how to, he doesn't know what to do with that. And he's like, what's that supposed to mean? And so George says, it's harder to be afraid of someone who looks ridiculous. And the teenager shifts, and he's unsettled, and he's trying to hide it. And so by this point, I think the little bit of alcohol that the teenager has ingested is starting to kind of take full. George is already drunk as a skunk, living by the cold river water. He's drinking to stay warm and everything. So The teenager kind of sits there in reflection, and he says, you should have fought back. And what he's saying is he's referencing back earlier in the film when he beat George up, right? When George was a leprechaun and he beat the hell out of him. So he's kind of referencing that again. He says, you should have fought back. And George doesn't look at him. He says, and then he's quiet. He says, well, would that have helped you? And the teen looks away, instantly. And then it's quiet again. He says, you don't know anything about me. And George is like, well, you run like you're being chased. And the kid says, well, I was being chased. George says, not by the cops. Right, and that line lands heavy. And so the teenager is staring into the fire. He picks up the tin again and, takes another drink. And so at our next scene, our next scene is anyway, I think there's a scene in between that I'm missing here, but it doesn't matter. So at this point, I think we have another scene with Margaret sitting at dinner with Carl, her husband, and they are reflecting on the day and the win that she got from the mayor telling her business is still going to be open. And they happen to see George on the TV, and she says, man, I gotta find that man. I gotta find him. He kept he started this whole thing. And then so after that is our next scene where it's back at George's camp, because both scenes are at nighttime. And so now the teenager and George, they're both drunk, completely plastered. And the world is softened. That's the setting. The world is softened. And George leans back and he's laughing, and his voice is warmer than we've ever heard it. He says, "You ever try running in boots 2 sizes too big?" And the teenager says, "Why would I do that?" George says, "Because they weren't mine." And so the teenager's laughing now, right? They're starting to bond a little bit, After the teenager had retaliated with violence to such a peaceful force, now, things have gotten so dire in his life, running from cops and everything. I think he's starting to be more open to his surroundings, and so now he's starting to see that George actually isn't a bad guy, despite beating the shit out of him earlier in the film. And so George goes on, he talks about this story. He says, "I was 16, and I borrowed these boots off my cousin. Thought they made me look tough." The teenager just says, "Did it? Did they?" George says, "No, they made me look like a duck." And George stands up and demonstrates waddling dramatically, stomping like a cartoon. And teenagers on the ground, he's laughing obnoxiously, loud enough to scare the birds out of the trees. He says, "A duck?" And then George continues. He says, "A cop was behind me yelling, 'Stop!' And I'm quacking down an alleyway at 2 in the morning." The teenager's just laughing and laughing and laughing. And George continues the story. "I get to this fence and I grab the top boot and it slips. And my pants tear straight down the back." Right? And so the teenager's like, "No, my gosh, shit," and they're laughing. And he says, look, continues, he says, "The whole alley saw the moon." Whole alleyway saw the moon. So, the laughter holds, and the George's tone shifts a little slightly.